Hey everybody, it's the Mad Master here. I'm doing another video. It's kind of a follow-up to my people who denied they were metal video from, I think it was a week ago. Or people that, because basically the subtitle should be people who still deny that they were in metal bands, even though they're metal singers, like Jeff Tate, Joe Elliott for a while, some other folks. Um, so this video is kind of about where I was kind of coming from that with that video. It's not a clarification video, it's just more going into detail what I mean. So what I mean about like some of my reflections back. So I'm just going to talk about what it was like being a metalhead in the 90s. So in the late 90s, I had kind of gotten into a lot of the European bands like Blind Guardian, and then just like old school ones that I'd never been into before, like Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, King Diamond, a lot of black metal like Emperor, got into Amorphous, all sorts of stuff. So just countless bands, because my friend, there was this record store and my friend went to, it was selling goth industrial stuff, and I kind of had gotten into a lot of that stuff, and then they started to get into like, oh, this is not, oh, some metal's not so bad. It was like the late 90s, like, well, there's some, like Mortiz was kind of getting big. Like this is before he went all industrial and stuff, like all this ambient kind of stuff, medieval music, kind of derived, whatever, fantasy music, and all sorts of stuff. Like there was kind of metal adjacent stuff becoming more accepted among certain goths and industrial rivet head kind of people. So that was kind of happening then, and I was kind of picking up that zeitgeist. And then one of my other friends was starting to get into like some of the stuff that was coming out on Century Media and so forth at the time, because that was kind of a big underground metal label that was kind of getting big. Relapse. So what had happened was I'd kind of gotten out of metal for a while, because I went to this high school that, I'm dating myself now. There was this word Hesher, which is also a movie now, but it was like a stereotype. You can look it up on Urban Dictionary about metalheads being these white trash, dullards that worked on their Camaro on their lawn, that they have on their lawn and stuff, working class stereotypes and everything. And so in the 90s, it was really tough. It was really bad, because what you would face scorn from all sorts of people. I mean, it was not like I was picked on that much when I was getting back, like the late 90s when I was getting back into metal, or even when I was like sort of ostensibly still a metalhead, but I didn't want to admit it. Someone's texting me. But the whole thing was really tough, because you had kind of gotten like cast out as someone that was, into this dated genre that was never going to come back. Oh boy, were they wrong. So thing is, like, what I was trying to say in my last video about, I think my words were a little flubbed when I talked about it was either Poison or Metallica. What I meant was, people thought when you mentioned metal, they either thought of Metallica or Poison. Like there was no like nuance or different shades or different, permutations of metal to them. So if they heard some heavy guitars, that sounds like Metallica, or they thought it was all hair metal. There's some people like some family members of mine that knew of Iron Maiden and all the stuff that they talked about and sang about, and they were a little more cued in. But like, I even had a teacher in high school that thought Iron Maiden were death metal. I'm just like, it's like they probably do like roar. I'm like, it's like there was a lot of stereotypes, back then. There was just like people didn't know what they were talking about. So you had this media that was just like, metal was this dated, old school thing from the 80s that we wanted to forget. And so even some of these magazines wanted to change the name. Like, I wish I could find these magazines, and I'd pay good money for them if I could find the actual articles and these editorials that were actually proposing we change the name of heavy metal music. I think it was Metal Hammer UK, or one of those things, as I mentioned before. But it was a weird time. I mean, so the actual mid 90s, like 95, 96, 94, was probably the worst. 95, I think I said this in a previous video, That was actually the death. To me, that was when metal was truly dead in the States, at least. You know, it had died. It was dead. Like there was, and this is around the time where I first saw Iron Maiden live with Blaze Bailey. So like, well, that was early '96. So it was weird because you had, it was like you basically were antiquated and seen as like, I don't know, you were antiquated and you were just like out of fashion and uncool to a lot of people if you liked metal. So I tried to hide it in school when I was growing up because I had gotten into metal, and then I kind of had to hide it a little bit. I wouldn't wear my Iron Maiden shirts and stuff for a couple years because, well, this is kind of getting a little hazy and psychedelic, this video, isn't it? Uh, so I should talk about when I got into Pink Floyd maybe. But anyway, so let's get out of the sun a little bit. Whoa, that's bad. But yeah, so I mean, it had gotten really weird with regards to how metal was perceived and metal was picked up on by the media and people. So people did use the word Hesher. Oh, Jesus. Excuse me for a second. This is kind of just, a video I'm doing pretty quickly, and I don't, I'm just going to get this released. I'm not going to edit this one at all. But so, I mean, it was pretty weird. You would have the word Hesher thrown around, and you would have word, just kind of your trashy person. You're not educated. People making fun of Iron Maiden and wanky guitars. A lot of times, like in the goth scene, like these girls and stuff, like would tell my friend or I would hear it. So I was bad with girls back then, because I was always trying to like leech off my friends back in the day about trying to get girls with it from them. But that's a different whole other long story, sordid tale that I won't tell right now. But so these girls like, oh my, this wanky guitar, wanky. Oh, that's so wanky. Oh, that's so, and they would be like cock rock. They would call like metal that had nothing to do with like they would probably even, if they were around today, like these people were like listening to some of the bands like people listen to today, like if they heard Amon Amarth, they would probably call it cock rock. When cock rock is like Led Zeppelin, Kiss, talks about sex and stuff. Amon Amarth, like that was how stupid people were and like ignorant. I wouldn't say stupid, but very ignorant and very closed-minded. But things changed, But in the late '90s, when I was really getting into the European bands and the underground bands, people were still pretty ignorant. They didn't know what the hell Blind Guardian was, or Emperor, or Symphony X, or any of that stuff. It was very underground. I mean, these festivals they played in America would be like at actual clubs, actual bars that would have Prague Power. I think the first Prague Power was at like a bar and shit. Until they rented out that theater in Atlanta that they do now every year, which is not happening this year, I'm willing to bet, but that's whatever. Kind of sad, a lot of stuff that's going on now, or not going on, I should say. But yeah, it was a weird time, and when I got into some of these bands, it was weird. But like shortly before that, when I was like in school as a kid, a little bit earlier, this is right before when I started getting into the underground bands and the European bands that I just mentioned. Shortly before that, it was like there was this kid, and there was a few people like this. They were getting into like some of these newer bands like Fear Factory and Korn and Machine Head, and they hated Iron Maiden and they hated classic metal, but they also didn't like a lot of death metal either. And that's what became the NU metal people. Because they were kind of like, oh, Iron Maiden's not heavy. It's like light and shit. I don't like Iron. I like Black Sabbath somewhat, but I should mention, like, Black Sabbath was always accepted in the 90s. In the 80s, it was less, you watch some of these movies about metal and stuff from back then, it's like Black Sabbath isn't as mentioned, but like in the 90s, Black Sabbath was the only cool metal band you like. I remember this punk girl that we went to school with, and she had this tape. It was like Paranoid and Heaven and Hell, like on one tape. They used to do this sometimes. I think some Russian companies do this still, where they put two albums on one CD, but this was a tape back then. She had Paranoid and she had Heaven and Hell with Dio, Ozzy and Dio, each side. She's like, oh, I like Paranoid, but I don't like the second side, Heaven and Hell. It's just too, I don't know if she used the word hair metal, but people used to say hair metal, call everything hair metal too. Like even if it wasn't even hair metal. Like I said about cock rock, like someone from back then, if you played a monomarth for them back then, like if you took some of the, if you took a time machine and played them that, they thought they would use words like cock rock, or they called everything that was metal hair metal, or it's just people had the wrong perception about heavy metal music back then. It was ridiculous, and it was an outcast music for sure, and it wasn't politically correct to like back then, in more ways than one. I mean, I'll give an example that's kind of weird, and I don't really care about this, but like all the grunge bands, all the alternative bands were like all socially conscious and like feminists ostensibly. They even did like these Planned Parenthood benefits and all this stuff. They were left wing and stuff, like Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder and all those people, So it got really uncool. I mean, obviously the grunge thing through all sorts of metal, all sorts of metal were actually like, it's like almost like casualties in a war, like civilian casualties, or forgot the term, but like where you're trying to kill some enemy, but all these other things get killed, as a result in a war. This is what happened in metal, because we have to destroy hair metal and cock rock, right? Glam rock. Oh, well, all these other casualties of this musical battle are, they're innocent of all this stuff that hair metal is, but we're just going to lump it all in, right? So that's what happened to a lot of metal. And one of the things that got out, that was better, for better or worse, that was not accepted in like the mid 90s, early to mid 90s, was like boob flashing at concerts that were like big among the hair metal bands, and like all the groupie culture and ostensibly drug culture, but we really know that was a myth, because they were all fucking shooting up that heroin, for the most part, a lot of those bands. But like publicized, like I think cocaine was probably less popular among a lot of these bands, just gonna do heroin, be depressed, and be politically correct, right? So, but in the late 90s and the early 2000s, flashing came back, in these new metal concerts and metal, and groupie culture kind of came back with like bands like Buck Cherry and all the Korn, we're talking, had these groupies and stuff, and the groupie culture came back. And I'm not saying it wasn't a thing in the grunge alternative scene, but it was like less accepted. Like you wouldn't hear about Eddie Vedder like banging a row of strippers backstage after a show or something like that. You wouldn't read. I mean, it's that kind of stuff wasn't as it wasn't as accepted to talk about. Maybe it did happen, but it wasn't like as open. Just like the excess of the 80s was kind of dead at the time. But then new metal, NU metal, I'll just call it NU. I was going to call it NU metal from now on. NU metal, because it had the umlaut and NU. It's not new metal. New metal at the time, to me, was fucking Paradise Lost, or like Opeth, or Blind Guardian, or whatever. That's new metal, but it's not NU metal. So I'm going to use NU metal from now on to refer to that. NU metal bands like Korn or Limp Bizkit brought back the debauchery, but it was just kind of lame, done in a lame way. But at the time, people just clumped it all together. So being a metalhead in the 90s kind of sucked, but you were kind of at an interesting position, because I'm blathering now, I don't care, I'm just going to release this, but you were in this position where you had this knowledge of this genre, of all these underground bands. You had to buy some magazine at some of these bookstores or grocery stores might have the magazine, but you had to order it out of a catalog or a little ad in the magazine. You'd have to order it, and sometimes it'd be like $30 for the CD. And I bought like a lot of the early Blind Guardian albums from this place that was like, it was only 45 minutes from where I live. So sometimes it'd come the next day, and I get so excited. It was so fun waking up, and when I was living at home, and open the door, and I see this this package, and it was like, it was, you know, pre-Amazon, but it was almost like the same thing because it was so close to home. And I would get so excited because I buy these import albums from these German metal, power metal bands and stuff, and progressive bands and all this stuff. So it was kind of an exciting time in the late 90s for me. But as I got into all this stuff, the more mainstream, quote unquote, heavy music bands I heard, the more I hated those bands. You know, the more, no, I just say, the more I heard this underground stuff, the more I hated the more mainstream bands in America. The more I heard Rhapsody of, you know, called Rhapsody of Fire, or more, you know, whatever, all these bands that I got into. And that's kind of what happened to me, because like it was an interesting time. So I'd wear shirts that nobody knew what the band was. People thought it was some, like, let's say Blind Guardian, for example. I had this Blind Guardian shirt that I ordered from this place. I think it was one of those mail order things. It cost like $40 or something. I was working, you know, part-time, living at home at the time when I graduated in high school and stuff. But I bought these expensive ass shirts from Europe, and people wouldn't know what the hell it was. They're like, what's that? Is that like a role-playing game thing? I wasn't even role-playing at the time. But even though I was doing it earlier and then I did it later, which I do now. I do role-playing now. But anyways, such a nerd. So people were like, what's Blind Guardian? Is that like Guardian? Or what is that? A dragon? Or what's Emperor? You know, people didn't know what all these bands were. Then you would meet the occasional like extreme metalhead that was into some of this stuff, and they would like give you the horns and stuff. Like the drummer that I usually, he was actually in high school. This drummer that joined my band later saw my In Flames shirt that I had at the time. In Flames was cool up to a certain point, by the way. I should educate you about In Flames, because In Flames used to actually be a good band, but metal elitist for sure. But yeah, anyways, so it was tough, but it was actually rewarding at the time. This is after high school, when you were into the underground metal and nobody knew what the hell it was. You were probably the only one on the block buying these CDs from Europe and stuff. Like, you would have to look, like maybe once in a while you'd walk downtown and see a shirt, but it was rare. It was like happened like every maybe 2 to 4 months. Maybe you'll see, like, you know, and then you started seeing more shirts. Iron Maiden reunited, and that was a big deal. And the NU metal probably helped that. Unfortunately, you know, it's kind of like they were a casualty of the hair metal death, but it also, the new metal, or shit, I forgot. The NU metal trend kind of helped with some of the better metal too. So it kind of pulled the better stuff up, even though the shitty hair metal clones in the late 80s and early 90s pushed the better stuff down. So the NU metal actually, like Ozfest, you know, would have second stage bands. You know, they had Mastodon, Voivod, all these bands. And of course the main stage bands usually suck, but not always. But so that's kind of what happened with metal in the mid to late 90s. And then you had this mysterious thing about people who you knew that were, this happened around like 2003, 4, 5. You started to talk to more people who would have, like, 10 years before, they would have been like, Iron Maiden, isn't that like some hair band? Or I kind of like, I used to like them, but then I got into rap and I'm such a better person. I'm a better person because I like rap now. Fuck you, you know? Or I'm a better person because I like alternative, because I'm more sophisticated. Even though this alternative band couldn't fucking shred their way out of a paper bag. Fuck you, you fucking smug assholes. Fuck you. People say I'm a metal elitist, but who's the smug one, motherfucker? Anyways, okay. Kind of going on a little rant there. You had these people that you would meet, you know, like a few years before, they'd been like, Iron Maiden, I used to like them. And they're like, yeah, I love Iron Maiden. I listen to them occasionally. You know, these people that a few years ago, they might not be into metal. They might not be a metalhead. But they like give props to Iron Maiden, or they give props to whatever. And then you would meet more people like that. Like, I played shows with bands, you know, opening for these bands or something. And you would meet these people. And they were in these heavier alternative bands or something. They would give props to Steve Harris and Iron Maiden or whatever. That didn't happen in the mid to late 90s. You know, I tried to join a couple bands in the late 90s. and it was all alternative style bands, and they didn't want like wanky guitar solos or whatever, wanky guitar solos. I'll just play like Jimmy Page a little bit. You can't play that Yngwie Malmsteen stuff. That's bad. That's bad for society to play what? Like Guitar World had, and I don't hate Blind Melon, or I actually saw him live because my brother, ex-brother-in-law liked him, so he dragged me to this show once. It was actually pretty good back in the day. But they did this thing where they reviewed. It was in Guitar World, like in the mid '90s. They reviewed all these songs, these videos by these bands, and they made fun of Dream Theater, and they were talking shit about the wanky guitar solos and all this stuff, and like, you shouldn't have to play that complicated. It's like people had that attitude when you're trying to form a band in the late '90s, and it was shit. So I mean, if I was in Europe, maybe I would have made it, in some band, because I could have joined like the rising power metal thing back then. But fucking in the States, it was shit. So at the same time, you were superior because you knew about all these underground bands, and you're like buying these expensive CDs from fucking Germany or France or Italy or whatever the fuck, So it was kind of a cool thing to have happen. But I regret not being a little bit older, or being in the wrong location, because the town where I'm at, alternative was the rule. It's never been a metal town, but at the same time, a metal town is kind of more, some of the metal towns are a little bit more like, they're not as enlightened in some ways as where I live, quote unquote. Of course, right now, I think they're very some of the people are acting very unenlightened. But anyways, that's it. That's what being a metalhead in the '90s was like. If you were already an outcast because of whatever, social anxiety, or being picked on, or having fucked up childhood experiences and having trauma from that, then you were probably even worse off. And obviously, like the West Memphis Three and all that, the Columbine. Well, they weren't really metalheads at Columbine, more rivet heads. But I guess you ostensibly you'd call them the metalheads. You were an outcast, but it was harder to deny when I bought a pair of Jinkos in high school, and tried to be this kind of alternative person for a while. Really, the extent of my alternative stuff was getting into more edgy stuff, like underground industrial, like Coil, or electronica, like Aphex Twin, and like Joy Division's Sisters of Mercy, and fucking whatever. So I wasn't really into, or Legendary Pink Dots or whatever. I wasn't really. I could have gotten into fucking Total Wet Sprocket or something, but I didn't really do that, or Rage Against the Machine or something like that. But I didn't really do that. I got into, at that point in time, that's what I got into. I mean, I'm still wearing a fucking Sandman shirt. I bet I'm fucking still goth as fuck in some ways. So, but so it was a difficult time to live in. But the late '90s were kind of a cool time, because it was kind of like nobody knew what the hell you were talking about. You can stand on your fucking perch and say, hey, I don't like all this modern, or not this modern stuff. I don't like all this popular stuff. I buy CDs from Europe. They're $40. Fuck you. I have an exquisite, cultured taste in a band that sings about dwarves and has like 50 guitar solos in each song. I'm better than you. So, on that note, I'm done with this video. And have a great day.